Thank you for joining me. I'm Michelle Heward and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow based in the Ageing and Dementia Research Centre at Bournemouth University. I'm going to talk to you today on behalf of the team listed on the slide, and I'm going to talk to you about our research looking at care home managers' experiences of supporting residents to navigate care home environments. So why is this important? Well, we know that around 70% of UK care home residents are living with dementia or severe memory problems. We also know that dementia can affect both spatial orientation, so that's people's navigation abilities, and reality orientation, and that's people's ability to orientate to time and place. And we know that losing any of these skills can have a really negative impact on well-being and people's sense of social inclusion. So ageing and dementia-friendly environments have been designed to compensate for these impairments and these physical changes that happen as people age and develop conditions such as dementia. And the aim really is to maximise independence and quality of life for those individuals. And in a number of care organisations, they are looking at how they can adopt these designs. And there are a number of reasons for this, not just increasing the well-being of the resident, also to support the workload and reduce the workload for the carers, and also to stand out and meet the standards of other competing care homes within the local area. So how can the field of neuropsychology have an impact on the field of dementia-friendly design? Well, within the field of navigation in neuropsychology, we know that navigation is based on different types of knowledge and strategies which rely on different areas of the brain. We know that ageing and dementia affect some brain areas more than others, and therefore ageing and dementia affect some navigation strategies more than others. However, this knowledge is not currently reflected in design guidelines, so there is a gap here in terms of the input that neuropsychology can make in the dementia-friendly design field. So in terms of our particular study, we were interested in looking at whether care home managers have any knowledge of dementia-friendly design principles, guidelines and audit tools that already exist, and whether and how care home managers currently support residents with dementia to minimise their disorientation around the care environments. And we wanted to do this because we thought, well, care home managers are the ones in the organisation that may have some autonomy and decision making that impacts on residents' day-to-day activities, and therefore they could be key to enacting an agenda around navigation within these environments. However, when we looked in the literature, we couldn't find anything about their experiences and understanding of these issues. So our exploratory qualitative study, we did 12 semi-structured telephone interviews with care home managers across the United Kingdom. And within those telephone interviews, we started generally with questions about asking care home managers about residents' orientation, navigation abilities, and then we moved on and focused more specifically on questions to draw out strategies that the care home managers might themselves be using to support residents. And we analysed the data using a thematic approach. In terms of the sample of care home managers that we spoke to, so of the 12, the majority were female, so 10 were female and 2 were male. All of them had a different job title, but they ranged from senior nursing staff to area manager. However, all of the people that we spoke to were experienced staff and none of them were new to the care sector or the management role. Most of them had responsibility for managing one care home. Only one of the managers we spoke to was managing 2 care homes. So of the 13 care homes that the 12 managers were managing, the majority were a medium size with 26 to 50 residents. The smallest had 15 residents and the largest had 71 residents. All of the care homes had residents with dementia, and it ranged from about 20% of the residents up to 100% in some of the care homes. In terms of funding, 6 of the care homes were privately funded, 2 were charity funded, 1 was self-funded, and the remaining 3 were funded by a mixture of all of those different funding approaches. So in terms of our findings, so I'm just going to talk to you about the first theme around aligning strategies with needs. So managers talked about how the strategies that they use to support resident orientation were aligned with the needs of residents. And they talked interchangeably about spatial orientation strategies and reality orientation strategies. But here we've just teased them out for you just so you can have some examples of what they were doing. So in terms of spatial orientation strategies, they used, care home managers talked about using landmarks such as signage, unique room furnishings, colour, and personalisation of areas such as bedrooms to support with residents' navigation. And in terms of reality orientation strategies, care home managers talked about having calendars and clocks on walls, having a regular programme of activities, so for example a bingo session on a Saturday, and experiential activity areas within the care home environment, so that might be a sweet shop or a cinema area. Care home managers also talked about how staff facilitated orientation and navigation of residents, and this was more pertinent in the care homes where staff were able to have a personal connection with residents and were able to have that familiarity and get to know them, rather than care homes where managers talked about relying on agency staff heavily. And so this one care home manager suggested if staff saw a resident walking towards the door, they would say, "Oh, can I help you?" And then, "Do you want to come this way?" So here you can see a mixture of how care home managers were making changes to the environment to support orientation, but also how the staff were supporting orientation of residents as well. And the next theme, intuitive learning. So care home managers talked about their dementia training and talked about how it was broadly based around dementia awareness, and there was little consideration for supporting residents' orientation and navigation. In fact, only one manager mentioned about learning about reality orientation approaches, and that's in the orange box, the first quote. You do your dementia training, you learn about disorientation to time and place. And only 2 of the managers actually commented that they had used existing design guidelines and audit tools that were available. One manager here says, "I used the King's Fund," which I found very useful. And another manager talked about conducting regular audits of the environment to ascertain whether they needed to make changes to their environment. Many of the managers then appeared to rely on their own intuition and past experiences in terms of developing these orientation strategies for residents. And this meant that lots of the managers were relying on reality orientation approaches rather than spatial orientation approaches. And this was so that the approaches would support the familiarity between the residents and the care home staff. A number of care home managers also suggested that they drew on their informal social networks of colleagues, and as the first quote in the blue box demonstrates, "It's just what you hear from experience, exchange of the words. Lots of people, they said to me, 'Oh, I heard this, you know,' and then I just try to find it and Google it." And managers appeared to rarely evaluate the success of the strategies that they were using, and they didn't seem to consult residents with dementia, or very rarely did they, and mainly residents in the earlier stages of dementia if they did consult residents. So as the last quote in the blue box shows, "My clientele are probably earlier stage on that side, so they've got more orientation. We discuss with them how do they want their room personalised and things like that." And so the third theme was around managing within a wider business context. And so managers discussed how they had conflicting priorities in terms of their existing workload and the business needs of the care home organisation. So managers talked about how care homes were expanding due to the need for space, but they also mentioned how they felt this had a negative impact on residents' orientation abilities. And in the orange box, the first quote from a care home manager, I think perhaps in the older part of the house, that is the harder place for them to orientate themselves, and they can get stuck down one end. And so this is an example from a care home that had grown over time, and so residents were beginning to get stuck in the older part of the building and not being able to get themselves out. And also managers suggested that residents with dementia were being moved from familiar areas to unfamiliar areas, and that this did have an impact on their spatial orientation. As the final quote shows, having to move them from one floor to another, that has become quite challenging because it gives them some disorientation. But as a new build, from a staffing point of view, you have to go with the business side of things as well. So that really reflects the kind of conflicting priorities that managers were working under. And then there was a discussion around how managers would like to balance, the homeliness and feeling of the care home environment versus having a clinical environment. And there was this perception amongst managers that dementia-friendly design is clinical rather than homely. So as the quote in the blue box shows, at the moment, we don't want a big sign saying toilet because we don't want to look too clinical. So we keep it homely rather than clinical and hospitally. And managers had a perception that for those with a mixture of residents with and without dementia, they had a perception that if they made changes to the environment that were dementia friendly, that would have a negative impact on residents without dementia. And other managers also discussed how the complexity of dementia and the fact how it impacts everybody so individually made it problematic for them to know the best approach to take in terms of changes to the environment. And the fact that not every change might suit all residents, or that residents' needs may change over time, made it more complex for them to actually try to do. So managers did suggest that there's no one-size-fits-all approach and that there's a need for some flexibility there. And so lastly, the implications for practice then from our findings. So we've identified that there's a gap between theory and practice. So on the one hand, there are a number of guidelines and audit tools available. And on the other hand, they're not necessarily being used within practice as they may be designed to be. And staff don't necessarily have an understanding that they exist and that they can use those to support their practice. So we feel that there's a need for inclusive design guidelines, and there's also a further need for training to promote the use of these guidelines within care environments. And we feel that training would be appropriate not just for care home managers and staff in care homes, but for other people who are involved in the design and development of care home organisations. So for example, architects and interior designers. And there's a number of things that we felt that the training and guidelines should include as a result of our research. We felt that perhaps there's a need for them to not necessarily be called dementia-specific guidelines, but to be called inclusive design guidelines, hopefully to overcome some of the negativity around the experiences that some managers has already reported. And we found that there's a need for the field of neuropsychology theory and the work around orientation and navigation to be included within those guidelines, as that could really help us to understand how we can compensate for those declining abilities. And we felt that the training guidelines would also be helpful to distinguish between reality and spatial orientation, and how that impacts upon a person with dementia when they lose those particular set of skills, and how that might be overcome within those care environments. And we also thought that the guidelines should highlight the importance of considering the lived experience of people with dementia, and particularly how care home managers and other other staff and people that are involved may seek the views of people with dementia, including those within the later stages of dementia, and include those within the strategies that they're developing. So thank you for listening. I hope that's been a useful overview of our project. Please do feel free to come back to me with any questions. My email address is listed here. And if you're interested in the wider research undertaken by the Ageing and Dementia Research Centre, then please do have a look at our website. Thank you.